Well, welcome back to another episode of Successfully Unsuccessful podcast. I'm your host, Josh Dietrich, and today, physically here in the house in St. Michael, Studio 3, I think this is called now. Welcome, Mr. Jason Paris.
Dude, good to see you again.
Dude, so good. Last time you were here, we were sitting like right over there. Yep, looks like a different spot on camera, but it's the same house, right? I think for you, you can tell that.
Yeah, the magic of production.
It is, yeah. It's awesome. You can kind of take something and transform it. But I loved getting to know you just the brief time we had, and the story. There's always more to the story, sure. Right? Kevin Bacon's 6 degrees of separation, or 7, whatever it is. But I'll have to pull out a souvenir because Jason Paris is a founder partner of Aleph Holdings, and I get excited because I've been riding around this thing. We're in this little guy. Well, this is the second one I've used. There's a third one coming for the race, Fathers for the Fatherless. And Aleph Holdings has been a key sponsor for 4 years. Is that right?
Yep.
Didn't even know it. What the heck do these guys do? I think I checked out your website one time. I'm like, they do some painting, something or other, right? Sure. And the entrepreneur in me is like, wait, but there's more to painting, but I hope to meet him someday. Moving on, right? Like something stood out. And so full circle, as I was chatting with Jeff Zog, the founder of Dad Awesome Podcast and the Fathers for the Fatherless Ride and partner with Venture. Somehow, Aleph, I was like, in our conversation, I'm like, you gotta introduce me to someone there. He's like, cool. Totally. Right. And so meet this guy, Jason. Turns out, you live 15 minutes away.
Very short drive. Yeah.
Maple Grove. Not only that, you have 5 kids.
Yep.
And how many boys, how many girls?
3 girls, 2 boys.
Okay. So slightly.
Sorry, 3 boys, 2 girls.
3 boys, 2 girls. Yep. Okay. So at least the boy outnumbering the girl thing is in line. Sure. So we got that going. The age of 37 now.
Yep.
And what's incredible is you've kind of in this spot of your life where you've had some business success, some pretty awesome business success where you're in the midst of navigating what life has for you next.
Yep.
And as a believer, we've gotten to know a lot more things in common around coaching and the importance of having goals and dreams and having systems for understanding where it is you want to go. Just fascinated by the journey and the progression that you're on, aligned with my story so much that I was just like, what did I write down? 6 or 7 things that we...
I thought it was very thoughtful things that you sent over of, here's some things that you're an entrepreneur, and I can tell it because you get these ideas, you throw them out there and then kind of see what takes root.
Yeah. Lots of lines in, lots of bombs, lots of missiles, whatever. Right. And so you responded with, some general interest in one of them being the podcast, of course, and here he is. Yep. So it's almost serendipitous to have you here in so many ways. But at the end of the day, I feel like it's the right time to dive in, share your story, hear a little bit more about you, the success.
Sure.
And, as anyone who's into philosophy, the idea of successfully unsuccessful came from my story and, the misnomer of what success means, but also the way it's phrased is that there is a continual progression and succession of unsuccess, and that is life, that is missing the mark, that is sin, that is, every day we walk in this path of being human, right? And so I'll just open with that, because a guy who comes from a background, and we'll dive into this, and builds something in a trade, turns it into a corporate machine. Tell us what Aleph Holdings is, what it is you do, and really what's been successful in that for you guys. This story is awesome. I'd love to hear just the quick origin story, couple minutes, and what you guys do and what you stand for.
Yeah, so Aleph Holdings, it was birthed out of Paris painting. So Paris painting was the initial economic engine and proof of concept. But Aleph Holdings, it's a holdings company, and it's focused on taking trades companies, specifically house painting businesses, and turning them from owner-operator jobs into assets. And that's something that we have a mutual incentive with the founder to do.
So cool.
So not every founder wants that. A lot of founders prefer that they have a lifestyle business that they control. There's that dichotomy between control and freedom. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's a God bless America kind of thing. But for those that do want an asset and want the freedom, we're really good co-operators that can come alongside them and help scale it into an asset.
Isn't that so true? And I think a lot of times we forget about what a job is, and the showing up for a W-2 and a paycheck. And someone who has an economics degree and spent just a very short time in corporate America understood that there's probably a very fine line between the path to building your own future and destiny and going after things and having freedom and autonomy. Like, until you spend time, backing up, did you always know you wanted to be an entrepreneur, or how did this whole thing go from, I'm going to go painting, but I'm not going to be a painter. I did that in college, but now I'm going to do it in a new way. I'm going to position this as a company that I can run and manage and use my brain to build a business as opposed to a trade. Because most people that get into the trades, or really any job, they don't understand they're actually building the asset, right? The asset is something that can be sold. So what did you do differently going into it, maybe that others don't really consider starting when they start their first painting company?
Yeah, I think it starts with perspective. And so not a lot of people know that is an option, that you can build something that's going to produce income independent of your energy and effort, is how I would describe an asset being.
I like that.
And it's just not something that's widely known. Having a job is not a bad thing. It can be an amazing thing. You can have kind of the pinnacle of what people strive for is having an amazing job where you work very little, make a lot of money, and it's super fun. And what else would you rather do with your life? It's a great thing to do.
Right.
But I think what was unique for me was just the perspective I had. So I don't think anybody would have pegged me for an entrepreneur in middle school or high school. I was very quiet, very shy. I would say pretty smart, kind of like an intellectual type of a student. Had a little bit of charisma, and so would be captain of a wrestling team or something like that. So maybe a hint there. But in college, it was just, College Pro Painters was a phenomenal entrepreneurial breeding ground for a while, and they won the Google search for summer college job.
Really?
And so I got plugged in there, got a taste of it. They gave me an opportunity I didn't deserve. I took with it. I ran with it, had a phenomenal college experience, and went to corporate America for about 13 months after graduating college with an economics degree. Had that tension between I know what entrepreneurism feels like and I know what clocking in, clocking out feels like. And had the classic conversation with my wife saying, I'm kind of drained at the end of the day, working 8 hours, and you're working maybe 3, being productive for 3, and then kind of water cooler talk for the other 5. As opposed to, I knew what it was like to work 80-hour weeks in the summers and be exhausted. There's a difference between being drained and exhausted. And when you're exhausted, you're excited, you're looking forward to the next day. When you're drained, you're kind of dreading the next day. And so, very supportive wife, in my early mid-20s, so it was easy to make that decision. But from the initial architecture, and I still have some of the old yellow legal notepad paper, I thought a $2 to $3 million house painting company would become an asset and allow me the freedom. And my biggest problem would be, where do I put all my yachts?
Yeah, there you go.
So I don't understand the scale and the size that's needed, but it's always with that end in mind of how I build something that becomes, I'm going to serve it for a period of time so that it can then serve my life.
Yeah, for sure. So taking this thing from, one entity, you, the founder, the case study, let's call it, right? You had a previous experience, you had a playbook, you knew how to paint, you were trained how to kind of run a painting company, but then going into corporate, you are there salary or hourly at this point?
Salary plus commission.
There we go. Yeah. Okay. And culture is neat, right? They have all the things you need, good benefits. But in that 13 months, like you mentioned, the difference between exhaustion and draining. What drained you punching the clock? Where were your gifts and talents, living compared to where you want them to live? Where was your, energy? Because when you're there, right, it's like you're being present and you're going to do a good job. It's not like you're surfing the web, right? But the reality is it may not be motivating. It may not be challenging. It may not be the thing you really just get excited about, right? So all those play a factor into it. So what was it for you?
Yeah, I think it's different stages of businesses too. And it was a Fortune 500 company. This is a very mature, stable business. And they're not looking to rock the boat. You win by the awesome momentum and inertia that's present. And so anything you can do, I would say as an organization, I don't fault them at all. This is what I would do if I were in their shoes. You want to make sure that momentum and inertia continues to just plod forward, and you collect your 7% returns every year. Right?
Yep.
Just bing, bang, boom. As opposed to, more of a startup company needs to be a lot more nimble, not more willing to shake things up. Inertia is not really part of the game. And I think I have a unique kind of outlier level of passion, and to be able to find an outlet for that passion was very important for me.
Yeah.
And understanding the stage I was in my life, that outlet was not going to be hobbies. It was going to be economic productivity. I likely wasn't going to find that in a corporate environment.
Yeah. Economic productivity, that's a good word for saying, side hustle.
Yep. Build your house first.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And the foundation there is great timing for, probably no kids, probably the energy level to spend the time and effort. Seeing that accepting status quo was majority of the time just making it look like you deserved a job, as opposed to, proving it through the productivity of the corporate, because I spent 8 years at Best Buy corporate world. Right. And then it was a very production heavy environment for myself to perform, both not only in the stores, but in the corporate world. So I found a passion in that. I found less than the need to punch a clock. And that's maybe why I lasted 7-8 years. But at the flip side, I still saw the sense of inertia, the generally always moving forward, but nothing drastically innovative, right? That would allow me to really expand my mind beyond what I could see in front of me, right?
Yeah, it's not a wrong thing. It's
No.
what you're into, and I felt like I could play that game. I can laugh at my boss's jokes. I can play politics. I'm
Yeah.
good at that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But that underlying aspect of so much passion, it's like, well, how do you harness that passion?
Yeah.
And you're in a stage of life where if you can harness it, through economic productivity, that's a really good thing. Later in life, you can harness it into hobbies and do fun stuff or volunteer. That level of passion. It's hard to find a greater outlet for pure passion than entrepreneurism.
So that's the bridge. The passion behind launching something wasn't necessarily, I see this big hole in the market, in painting, right? There's a lot of painters and the barrier to entry is low. So the passion was certainly not to run a paintbrush, because you were not the operator in the sense of the tradesperson running the brush. You were the man with the math, right? Yep. The economic side, the business side. And so where was the passion? What was it for you to say, I was a painter once, but my passion to leave corporate, I can measure in this way. It was, and how did that decision to start that company and call it Paris Painting, cool name. I was like, no idea that was your last name. Like, oh, it's just kind of a cool name, right? Yeah. And I'm sure that's part of it. But launching that in terms of your passion, where was it translated? Because, many people think that they actually have to do the job itself, right? The company has to be the passion, and that can be further from the truth, I think, in many cases.
Right, the classic E-myth.
Right,
So
for sure.
do you need to be the technician?
Yeah, exactly.
I think that was beaten out of me early on, even just in college. So in college, like I said, College Pro Painters won the Google search that day, and they were a phenomenal entrepreneurial training ground back in the day. And they really taught you that, you were not, your time was much better spent either doing sales or hiring people or dealing with the conflict resolution than painting jobs for productivity. And so that was just the opportunity cost concept was something I understood early on. And so it wasn't a temptation that I had to overcome. It was something that was ingrained early on, and I understood kind of from the get-go.
So that temptation to overcome would be likened to, you actually love the brush. Right? Sure. You find joy in seeing the work. Well, you still do, right? You get the photos and you get to present them on the site and be a good marketer. But some people find the therapy in the work, right? Was there was there ever a temptation? Because you did some of that work in college, right?
I did.
Yeah.
Yeah, I did it for a summer. Not really. Not for me.
Because the engineering was in the business.
Yeah. And I would say, if you do love painting, this is where you get to decide what you want to, the life you want to architect and life design and all those things. Maybe you would love to be a self-employed painter. Right. And it's like, what better life could you have? It's kind of like the classic story of the guy who is out there fishing and just enjoying life. And then a Westerner comes and says, why don't you build a big operation and you can get all this money and free time and then you can do whatever you want. And the guy says, well, then I'd want to fish all day.
Right.
And just kind of plod along. So there's nothing wrong with that. It just wasn't, I never loved the craft of painting.
And I think let's unpack that a little bit, that story, right? Because that's what it's all about. It's like, it's not just the passion, right? It's a gifting, it's your God-given abilities, but it's also the ability to serve. And then it's also the ability to provide for your family, the economic engine, as you described it. And I love that word. And so I think in the midst of all that, I often talk about ikigai, and being purpose or reason for being. But in that example, if you're going to fish anyway, want to do it on your own and you're catching onesie twosies, or you're painting on your own, one house at a time, that being the passion, in that case, you'd be, it'd be like you paint in your own house and continue to find painting jobs because you love it. Like, then you're an artist, right? And so it's like that concept. And I think so many people struggle with this between building a company that supports a passion of yours, but that may not be their passion. Because for me, that is the passion, is building the thing. It doesn't matter what it is I'm selling, right? So what's in your mind, what's another way for someone to consider that? Because I think a lot of people fall into the trap of they have to go do something they love, but that doesn't always translate to the actual job or the economic piece that makes the money.
Yeah. Whether it's the actual thing that's happening or the drive behind what you're creating, I think if you want to be in entrepreneurism, there has to be passion.
Yeah.
And it has to be an unrealistic passion that you have, because you're going to get lows that you probably should not push through.
Bingo.
But if you do anyways that are for irrational reasons, that's going to help your chances of success. But yeah, whether it's the end results, so the ends versus the means, the passion has to be there.
There you go.
I would say for myself, the actual painting itself, I can get excited about it. I can talk about it, I can sell it. But I wasn't passionate about myself physically painting. I was really excited to build an asset and see what that could do for my life. There you go.
And I think that's the piece that people miss, is understanding that, when we're given gifts, part of that building block ability, putting Legos together and seeing the transformation, and especially when it comes to wearing all these different hats, that's one of the biggest benefits, I think, of your model, right? So let's talk about that. You end up creating a niche then where you scaled beyond just Paris painting, and then you moved into a model of multiple painters, basically saying, hey, we figured out the recipe to handle the business side of things, so you can create the freedom to figure out how to hire, but have the support you need. When did that flip? When did the idea say, with the end in mind, the means to an end was, I'm going to paint, I'm going to leave the world behind of being the paintbrush artist, build a company, but knowing that I could do this for a bunch of painting companies. When did that click? Lifestyle design, in what phase were you like, I got it? Was that right away, or did that happen later?
That was not the vision right away.
No.
I think once you start to have options in life, you get to reset your perspective and maybe set new horizons.
Yeah.
And so for me, my horizon gets a little muddied until you have options.
Yeah.
And without options, it's kind of get honed in.
For sure.
And how do you open up that funnel so you're kind of all funneled in? Then that funnel gets decluttered. Now your horizon can open back up and you get to make some choices. And for us, it was really, when Paris painting hit stability, probably north of 8 million, maybe north of 10 million, started to decide, what would we be passionate about doing from here on out, right? None of us are worried about how to make our mortgage payments. It's really about, what are we passionate about doing? We continue to grow Paris painting, great for us. And then you do the thought exercise of fast forward 20, 30 years, you have all this money in the bank account. What do you want to do? Well, I'd love to help people build assets in their lives. And it's like, well, how would you do that? Probably in the domain I know, which would be house painting. And does it take a lot of money to do that? No. It would probably take a time machine. I'd love to go back 20 years and start that.
Right.
And so that was the thought exercise of, we continue to grow a home base and serve ourselves, or we could teach others how to fish, benefit from that for sure. And I'd love it if it was just, here's the playbook and here's the template of how to do it. That'd be great from an investor standpoint. what we found is it takes a lot of going shoulder to shoulder
Yeah.
with individuals and saying, we're going to build this asset with you. Obviously, here's the playbook. Here's our ERP. Here's the software. Here's the learning management system. But you need someone to do it with you. Otherwise, you would have hired a coach.
Yeah.
And that's been our experience. And I think something we're uniquely qualified to do is we are very good co-operators with these founders.
Yeah. So what is the biggest number one thing you see operators currently struggling with, right? And what's the trajectory after what period of time? What are some of the metrics or KPIs you use to see, you know what, we made a good bet? Because we'll dump into this in a second about understanding who the bet is and what the bet is. But like, when you understand that you made a good bet, what does that look like? What is the founder experiencing at that point when you guys partner and make it work?
Yeah, I think it starts with getting them free of, I call it the core three. And so painting companies are not super complex. There's sales, there's production, and there's the office machine that connects it all together. And a lot of that times it's the founders doing one or multiple of those roles. And if we can get the founder to just be the president of the company and not be doing all the work in it, that's a good first step. Now, to do that requires the infrastructure and the understanding of how the roles work and how do you track everything. And so that's laying a lot of the groundwork for that. Ultimately, the goal is to get the founder to an option to decide, do they want to be involved in the business or not? And we have some people where they're like, yeah, I'd love to be the driver of this business and grow it to be a huge business. Others say, as soon as I can get out, I want to get out. And I would love for you guys to hire an integrator for me. And we obviously can't do that day one. You have to build that foundation. You have to build those core three. You have to then be able to start to scale through skill. But that's what we start to look for and see is, how do we get that founder defunneled from all those key roles in the organization?
Isn't that the thing, right? That's keeping them back from not only enjoying life to its fullest, but like even their business, its potential, the asset you talk about. And that's just really the key here about being a steward. Like, okay, if that painter operator views this thing as a job and he just shows up to collect his money, like, okay, but he's been given the opportunity to build something bigger than himself. And when he takes that serious and starts realizing that there are layers of fulfillment beyond the paycheck, expand your mind, right? The perspective gets bigger and you say, you know, I can live the life I want. So what are some of the things that founders are doing if they're not going to choose to be an operator, but you guys are going to hire an integrator? Like, are they semi-retiring? Are they going fishing, back to the fishing thing?
I mean, a lot of them want to be the visionary of the company. And so a pure visionary in the business where they're not in charge of anything operations day to day, but to get set the path, think big picture, maybe work on some projects, deal with the culture of the company. That's their ideal scenario. We've got a guy in Tennessee where he's now taken the role of, he's got an integrator in his company that handles the day-to-day. He's a part-time visionary, and now he's working with other of our partner companies, helping them with the onboarding.
Oh, so cool.
He finds joy in that.
So
myself, I like ultra running, and I have 5 kids, and I like flying planes. So, for everybody, it's a little different.
So that time piece, right? So now you've been able to architect a business model that really you're choosing your involvement. Is that right today in the business?
Yeah.
And so how did you come to the place of deciding? Because I think today even you might be able to book a call with you on the website. Are you still taking, or is that?
So, yeah.
Yeah.
We're redoing the website.
Sure.
I would say there's been a couple of stepping stones. So in Paris painting, I was very involved up till probably 2021, maybe. And now then I've slowly phased out, and I haven't done a bid or talked to a customer or visited a job site in over 5 years.
Wow.
And so last things I was doing was more email focused, trading out the coordination team. And then in Aleph Holdings, we started building apartments. I was heavily involved in that. Hired our framing crew, got us up on L10s, and now we have a guy who knows what he's doing, and he's on the day-to-day job sites of those apartments. And we're starting to phase out our apartments now that apartment builds, now that the interest rates have been so high.
Yeah, cost of capital.
So those have all been locked in for some time. That with the partnerships, I would say I was critical to get our first 7-8 partners. I think we're at 14 or 15 right now. And the importance of me is slowly phasing out, which is a good thing. As a founder, you always kind of look for that stage of, well, how do you get the flywheel going so it will continue to turn without you?
Yeah.
And so I'd say now I'm not involved in the onboarding. I'm not involved in the ongoing coaching. I sit on the board, so I do make decisions about who we take on or don't take on as a partner. I think I'd always be an active board member in Aleph Holdings. But as far as my day-to-day recruitment role, which is much more of a magnet than a hunter,
Right.
That's kind of the last thing that I've been involved in there.
And that's culture piece, right? There's some psychology there. There's some people relational things, which also translates to your passion that, you kind of borrow right now with some of the coaching you do, right?
Yeah.
And so I feel like that's a lot of what happens. You kind of end up doing something because it's not work.
Yep.
And like my day often is meeting with lots of guys, and I find so much joy in that and the opportunities that come from that. It's not work for me, right? So be able to connect like this, it's like, oh, there's a layer to this guy. And then, something comes up and I know a guy and introduction happens and there's fruit from it, right? So that's key. And I think understanding that the pieces you stay involved in. So like, same thing for me, building some of the businesses. And for me, the e-commerce space was identifying the right products to bring on, launching them, and then, managing the marketing of them. Well, after about 30, I had the recipe and I said, I need to hire somebody that can just
follow the recipe.
Right. Yeah. And then because I knew my calling was to, what other strategies could I deploy to build this at a new level, right? How could I reach more people? How could we expand internationally? How do we find new channels of marketing, right? And so naturally, I stayed involved in the business to do that. And then, launching a new business, it was like, I see a problem. I have capital, and the solutions to solve that problem are with connections, and I need this guy, and let's bring them together. And we launched this company, and after about a year and a half, I go, my capital's working for me, and I show up to these calls, but I'm not doing any of the day-to-day work, and yet this company is growing. Like, how do you describe that feeling to others when you get to live in your calling, you get to see the fruits of your labor, and you're not, to your word, drained at the end of the day? Like, how have you found fulfillment and then being able to go do this other crazy stuff we'll talk about next?
Yeah, I think it's good to acknowledge there's a dual feeling of that. So there's certainly a feeling of, hey, it's paid off. The sacrifices I've made have made sense. The trauma you've gone through has come to fruition. There's also a sense of loss, and there's a sense of loss of I'm no longer needed. I'm not a critical cog. This is something there that will continue to thrive without me.
Right.
And those are all great things. Those are all good things. I can say with a smile on my face. But there's also an emotional side that it's hard not to feel that sense of loss. It's like, oh, I'm not needed. Oh, this is now. I got to a point where no one else could have gotten it there, and now it's going to, because we're at this point, professionals can come in and continue to scale it, and I'm actually not only not needed, I actually may get in the way. Yeah,
they can do better than I can, right? Like the professional, like the generalist is great, but like I'm not the absolute specialist, right? So let's get out of the way. So would you say that the guy with absolute pride in founding the company and starting the company and having the rules and unwilling to delegate, right, has the biggest challenge with letting go of that?
Vast majority will never get true freedom because of that. Yeah. Right? And they want to control everything. And in some ways, I don't know if anyone would say it out loud, but they would rather have control and power than freedom.
Yeah, for sure.
And you'd say, like, would you rather, let's just use random numbers here. Would you rather make $400,000 a year and get to control everything? Or would you rather make $1.2 million, but you're not needed at all? And it's like cognitive dissonance where a lot of people choose that $400,000. And it's just a lot of it's the ego death and the ego trauma that comes with those things I was talking about of, oh, I'm not needed. Oh, I'm actually getting in the way if I continue to lean in there. I'm the founder, so you're rewarded with equity, and that's going to continue to scale. But I think it's fair to acknowledge both sides of that situation.
Totally.
To say it's not all just happiness and sunshine and roses. There's a trauma that you go through.
Oh, for sure.
That is the cost to receive that reward.
Identity even, right? Like for me, fortunately, I've been in the position where that transition I couldn't make fast enough because I was on to the next thing. I saw it. And I fortunately had partners I was kind of the mess it up crew, you know, and then my partner was the cleanup crew.
Yeah.
And so it was like, oh, naturally he's here to get it to that next level, and I can go mess up the next thing, you know? And so to your point though, it's like, this versus that, and people don't consider that often. It's like, to go fast, you go alone. It's easy. You know, you have control, you can go fast, you can choose right now what you're going to do. But to go far, it's annoying. You got to get consensus, you got to get buy-in, you got to make decisions together, you got to lead, you got to delegate, you got to manage. It's like,
you have to influence, not control.
Bingo, right? But to go far, we have to go together. And so a former CEO I worked for learned a ton, and I was like, dude, why would you give up so much of your company? Well, so much was only 20%. So it was a lot easier for him to answer this. But he said to me, Josh, would you rather have the entire juicy grape, you know, just the one grape to yourself? Or would you rather have a really nice piece of that watermelon? And I'm like,
depends how well you are.
Let's talk about
mentally.
it. Yeah. I mean, right. And where does your giftings and passions live? So what's interesting, right? In the choosing of what's next, the lifestyle design.
Yep.
What period of time did it take you from my work here is finished sort of feeling vibe to you sort of inching off on your own, exploring other things? Because no one was asking anything of you, right? And you're the driver, but now you're no longer driving anything specific. So you start to sort of either fade off or go after something. But what was that like for you to sort of get to now, knowing you still have this great company, and like, young dude, young kids, it's summer, what's next? How do you choose?
I would say, so I'm in the middle of that.
Oh yeah, that's right.
So I'm like living that as we speak. But I have passions, I have hobbies, and I've had a pretty intentional design to my life for some time. And so for the last, 15 years, I've been using this tool called the Life Planning Arrow. And so it helps kind of lay out my intentions, and I backpedal goals into it and follow the passions. But I'll just tell you, lately it's been a lot of fulfilling of hobbies and interests I haven't had time for.
Right.
So like I said, I have 5 kids, we homeschool, so spend a lot of time at home hanging out with the kids. I've gotten into ultra endurance sports. And so that's something, first when I was initially founding the companies, I did it at the expense of all my life areas.
Right.
So at the expense of my physical well-being, at the expense of my hobbies, at the expense of my family. And now I have a lot more time and freedom to lean into the family, lean into my physical wellness, lean into hobbies. I unabashedly play quite a bit of video games right now. And so that was something.
Xbox, PS4, what are you on? PC?
Nintendo Switch.
Just
a Switch, yeah.
Are you shooters type
Mostly
game?
all Zelda.
Zelda. Dude, this is so cool.
So,
there's the season, and this is the thing, right? To be able to enjoy some of the things you weren't able to do because of the sacrifices you made from the seasons you were in.
So when we had our second kid, I was in the midst of scaling Paris painting, and I loved playing video games all through college and as a kid, especially as a young kid. But I made the decision to dismantle my gaming computer after we had our second kid. And it was one of those things where I did not have the reactive discipline, but I did have the structural discipline to say, if I have this gaming computer, I'm going to come home after a long day of work and I'm going to want to play for 2 hours. But I don't want to play for 2 hours. But I can't stop myself from playing for 2 hours. But
so I'll do something, yes.
Is I can dismantle the gaming computer and turn it into an art piece on the wall.
Oh my gosh.
So I did that. But now I have the time, I can go back and I'm starting to play a lot more games. And I play them with my kids and it's a ton of fun.
Have you reassembled the PC?
Nope.
Okay,
no,
good.
It's still
art?
At this point, it's a super old motherboard.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like it's like a GTX like 300 series.
Just like that, it's outdated. Yeah. That's so good. So okay, that's part of it, right? So lifestyle design in my mind is being able to first understand what it is you want out of it, right?
That's the hard work.
Right. And that's the hard work, because that's what am I good at?
Yep.
What do I get excited about, right?
Commercials will tell you one thing. Marketing will tell you one thing.
So your 15 years of going through this life coaching framework, you've been working on that, but like the real work is when it's actually reality. Like, oh, wait, so my phone isn't ringing off the hook. I don't have any meetings on my calendar. What do I get to do, right?
There's a little bit of that. It's also, when the rubber meets the road, what are you willing to sacrifice for?
Yeah.
And so it happens, there's always a trade-off in all the time you get to, even when you have a lot of free time, there's always a trade-off that happens. And so what would you be willing to sacrifice something else for? And that's where I said marketing will tell you one thing. There's a lot of things that sound good, but is it actually what you want? I think you truly find that out when you start to sacrifice for it.
You do. And you have to put a couple lines in sometimes. And like, it sounds good to go on vacation, right? But then you go on vacation every day, you start to miss the routine of your own bed, right? And going from Airbnb to Airbnb, like that only lasts so long, right? So there's some of that to be considerate about, right? And what does this really look like in the season that I'm in with, with 5 kids, knowing that they get to grow up with their dad at home, and I can be as involved or as little as much as I want to. Like, I'm the math guy, so maybe that could be an area that I,
what classes can I teach? And
right.
then you start thinking through this. I know you're big into the word stewardship.
Yeah.
And you say like, well, am I being a good steward of my life if I just hone in and serve my family? And, I think there's an element of, or am I a good steward if I only hone in and serve myself? And there's a little bit of a paradox there, because I think the best way you can serve your family is by first taking care of yourself. If you're not well spiritually, mentally, physically, good luck serving your family.
100%.
One of those things fall apart.
Yeah.
And then same thing with the family. If you're not, very healthy with this relationship with your spouse, with your children, if you're not managing your estate well, good luck serving the world.
Bingo.
If one of those things are falling apart, you're gonna have a hard time impacting the world. But I do feel like there's an element of you don't losing sight of the stewardship of your life and saying, how am I supposed to impact my friendships and relationships? How am I meant to impact? I've changed the word. I think we talked about this last time, but the word vocation. Yeah. I've changed it to investments. And how do you have that investor mindset on impacting the world? And then how do you have an impact through volunteer work? And it's really tempting to just focus all in on yourself. It's really tempting to just focus all in on your family. But don't forget to not just yourself, but your family, not just your family, but the world. Yeah, that's good. So I use a tool called the Wheel of Life. It's nothing unique, right? So I've actually rebranded it and add some complexity to it, but I call it the core dependency assessment, because I believe at the core, it is really your physical, mental, relational, financial, spiritual health, but those are just components. But at the real core, God created us and in his image and with intention. And so that will comes from the Father. And so when I look at, his order of things, love God, love others, make disciples, these are non-negotiables. And so how am I loving God and organizing my day around that? How is that a guiding principle? How am I loving others? Well, I'm called to love my wife like as Christ loved the church. So in order to do that, am I investing in that? And the next layer of that is your children, and then the next layer of that is others. And as you're talking about this, geez, that's a lot of stuff, right? And then inside of that, well, how are you nurturing your relationship with God, and how are you doing that with your wife? And you can get lost in the practicality of just those two things, and completely forgot about the fact that there's some other hobbies and some passions in the physical side of you, right? So for me, that core dependency is this dynamic of the trade-offs, right? And so a wheel that's not perfectly round is going to have a more difficult time rolling, and we see this when our tires get low. So it's a good way to assess the different areas of our life. But what do you use to sort of truly sort of understand and measure the imbalances in these ways? And anything in your framework that's helped you, oh man, my relationships are out of whack, or my physical being is out of whack, or my diet. Any tips that someone can start with today to start being more intentional in those areas? I think there is an element of, I found myself being more focused in areas than not throughout different seasons as far as moving the ball forward. So if there's a major deficit, it'll typically scream out at you. And for sure. I work with people where it's like, your relationship with your wife is very important this quarter. That is an important element.
Because you hear it, right? It's like it's like almost oozing out of them.
Screaming out at them. And it's, there's not that much that they're doing on their mental, hobby well-being this quarter. They're focused on their business and their wife. But there are other quarters where I'd say there's areas in my physical well-being where the goals are maintenance. Or maybe elements of the relationship with my wife where it's maintenance. And then there's a different area where it's more about moving the ball forward. And so I think for me, there's not every category of life where I'm driving forward and breaking a new frontier every single quarter. But there is always this idea of if you're not moving forward and moving backwards, you got to at least maintain. and kind of that slow plodding nature where you get some pretty cool results over a long period of time. But I'd also say I'm in my, mid to late 30s and just getting rolling. I'm in a new season of life now where I did a lot of intentionality and focused on the economic engine component of my life that has now allowed me the resources and freedom to start pouring into other areas and, play that out for a decade, and we'll see.
It's awesome. And I'm not an expert. I'm very much so,
maybe in like 40 years we'll be experts.
Yeah, exactly. But I did have a sense of this before I actually had to choose what's next. And it was fascinating that I had this business that was growing and I was involved as much as I liked, but I was playing pickleball 3-4 hours a day because I could. And I had a deficit in my physical well-being. I needed some level of socialization, and I was doing both of those things, and it was like, oh, well, there was a trade-off, but because time is still limited, there were still multiple trade-offs. And to your point, like the awareness and the perspective of what's out of whack is a starting point, but some people aren't even necessarily thinking about that because they're just trying to move the ball forward to survive in the financial world, right? And providing for their family and working the long hours and having to drive and having to travel because that's what the work requires of them. So I think if anything comes from this is that there is a sentiment and a joy and a peace that comes from progress and being able to look back and say, like compounding interest, I started with this, and here's where it's at now. Let's talk about that in your spiritual life. And so we briefly talked about growing up in the church and, a pretty significant thing impacted you as a child and maybe stuck with you for seasons of life, kind of questioning, leaving you, God, where are you? How do you play a role in my life? And in fact, do I even need you? Right. And so I know so many people, God is just given. I believe there is a God. I know that here, but it doesn't always sink into even what that means in our heart and how we operate our day-to-day lives, working with our partner, Jesus, and the Holy Spirit every day, the ultimate partnership. So I'm just curious, your take on this. If you unfold the past and the version that Jason is now, where are you? Are you pushing the ball forward in faith? Is it one of those maintain things? Because it comes, and I believe it's an ongoing staircase of growth. It should be, right? Because until we meet Jesus, it's like we have more to learn.
Yeah. So in my framework, the spiritual one is a little bit of a unique category. So it's one of 9 categories that I'll call out in the life areas. So there's like personal life area, macro, family macro, and then world macro. Each of them have 3 subcategories. So on the personal side, spiritual will be one of the 3 subcategories in the personal large area. But then when I go to my purpose is a lot more spiritually focused than any other description.
Makes
sense.
So
my purpose is I'm made to praise, revere, and serve God, and that has a spiritual element to it. So in some ways, spiritual is really the foundation of all the intentions that I put forward throughout my day. In some ways, it's one of 9 categories.
Yep.
But it's a little different in that sense. As opposed to if you were to talk to me, are you moving the ball forward constantly, physically or mentally, or with your children? Those intentions are made to design to drive towards my purpose, which is a spiritual purpose. I suppose I've worked with people who their purpose is like hedonism. Like they want to experience and all the amazing things of life. Right. And
I think you described it as pleasures, right?
Yeah. All the pleasures, all the experience seekers, live life to its fullest would be a nice way to say it. But for me, it's more of a spiritual purpose. So I'd say, all the intentions in my life are always with that mindset of to what ends is it achieving?
Yeah.
And is it achieving that ends of praising, revering, and serving God?
So to get to that point, even the foundation, praising, revering, and serving, right? Those are big words, and to have that be kind of a core, right? To your point, it's one of 9, but it's also a core.
So it's a purpose. You got it. And it's like it'd be the first principles. And so it'd say, I do not. So then you got to go through, you have your purpose. Then you have all the things that are not your purpose. And I would call them intentions.
Okay.
So I have intentions for each of my life areas.
Gotcha.
But then I ultimately have to call out the intention of, like, the purpose of my life is not to be healthy. The purpose of my life is not to be wealthy. The purpose of my life is not to have a great relationship with my kids. The purpose of my life is not to have a great relationship with my spouse. All those things could come in conflict or be in alignment with praising, revering, and serving God. That is my primary purpose.
Dude.
And it'd be saying, would I sacrifice my health for that?
Yeah. Yeah.
I should be say yes. Would I sacrifice wealth for that? I should say yes.
Yeah.
Would I sacrifice the relationship with my kids for that? I should say yes.
How do you get to that point, right? To understand at the core, right? Because there's a spiritual progression here to make these three very specific things part of your core purpose. But it wasn't always that way. And you grew up in the church, right? Yeah. So what was the denomination you grew up with?
I have no idea.
No, Catholic Church, Lutheran.
It wasn't
Church,
Catholic,
no.
And it wasn't evangelical free.
Okay,
so it was something
a Protestant, non-Catholic.
A Protestant, yeah.
And you going to church regularly with your family,
Yep.
all those things, and then at some point, what? Like,
yeah. So I'll kind of give you the backstory, and I think it'll lead to how do you get to making those first principle statements.
Yeah.
And so grew up in the church, great nuclear family. My mom passed away when I was 8, and she was really the spiritual bedrock of our family. And so I can't imagine what it was like for my father. You know, he had been married for a decade plus. He had 2 kids with his spouse, and suddenly his wife passed away. Has a big impact on my father. He really, it's a challenge for him. And I can't even imagine what that's
I can't
like.
imagine, right?
So our home life becomes quite different from then on out. There's various coping mechanisms. He ends up getting remarried to a gal who has some kids, and it immediately is a very volatile home environment. So our home looks very different from the first 8 years of life.
So at 8, and then when did you inherit some siblings? And how long were you?
Maybe 11, 12.
So then you spent the rest of your middle school, teenage, high school years?
Really loving going to school. Yeah.
Wow. And how many then did you pick up as step brothers and sisters?
2.
Okay.
Yep, 2.
Okay.
Yep. So yeah, really loved going to school. Really loved picking up hours at the grocery store.
Yeah.
And it was a very different. I mean, we'd still probably go to church maybe Christmas, Easter, but just a very different home environment.
Yeah.
Went to college at the University of Minnesota, very nice secular school.
Yep.
I would call myself pretty good academic, intellectual, and I would just harass the campus crusaders whenever they come around the hallways. And to be fair, most of them didn't know what they really stood for, and they were easy targets, right? So they're pretty easy for me to pick on.
Yeah.
Did that, went through, I think I was 21, 22 when I had some big life shakeups. So started with reading the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People by Stephen Covey.
Yep.
Starts about start with the end in mind.
Yep.
And that was a hard thing for me to reconcile. We kind of talked about, what does the end look like?
Yes.
Well, I think I know the answer. It's pretty obvious.
It's retired.
Wife,
yeah.
bench 350.
Yeah.
And I'm rich.
Yeah. Right.
And I was like, but would I sacrifice for that? And I'd gone through that program, College for Real Painters, where I'd ran a student painting company. I started to learn what accountability looks like for the first time in my life, of working with a business coach and saying, what do you want this business to be? And so I want to do this. It's like, well, that means you have to do that. I'm like, I don't know if I want to do that.
Right.
I actually do. And so dealing with that, having that exercise of what true accountability looks like, and achieving your goals that you say that you want to set out and achieve, combined with reading that book, combined with just a serendipitous reconnection with my mother's side of the family, who we had disconnected with for a long time, just, for probably obvious reasons of pain and sorrow.
Not intentionally, but just kind of happens, right?
Yep. So was out, reconnected with my aunt and that side of the family, and she was very, very strong spiritually. And then had just a shake up in my personal life. I was dating a girl. We were living together. We ended up breaking up, but still being stuck in a lease together. And that was a challenge for us. So I ended up moving back to my parents' house. So kind of choosing the lesser of 2 dysfunctions at that standpoint. And so there was just one night I was reconnecting with my aunt, asked if I go to church with her, got my hands on a Bible. I was reading the Bible one night. Everything sucks in my life. And we didn't have heat on in the basement, and it was like cold. And I'm just sitting there reading this. I got to that point of saying, if this is all I have, I'm fulfilled.
Wow.
And there was that's kind of that clear moment that people would point to. And I definitely knew God as a child, and I could hear the Holy Spirit audibly. And so it wasn't like a complete forsaking, but that is the moment that I will point to where I say, I'm sitting there reading the Bible, going through the scriptures, and it's fulfilling me so much to the point where I can say, if this is all I have, I'm fulfilled.
Yeah, man. And I think that's incredible because at the core, like, we take advantage sometimes of understanding all of the needs we have, and then how many things are just truly not needs, right? And really the needs have become wants or nice to haves. And, especially in the Western culture, like, everything practically has been a want, And so when we talk about our daily bread, and we talk about, like, being in the desert wandering for 40 years, right? And that God will provide, and there's manna in the desert. Brandon Lake has this song, Honey in the Rock. There's honey in the rock. And it's just the principle that he is all we need, right? And he is the provider, Alpha and the Omega, beginning and the end. Jehovah Jireh, my provider. Jehovah, I couldn't even go through them all. But in Hebrew, yeah. Is that Yahweh? Is Yahweh? Yeah. So you go through the list, and this is who God is. Yeah. And when you get to that point to realize sort of like nothing really else matters, is a light bulb feeling to say, like, then everything I do from here on out better honor the one that got me here to this place, to say he's all I need. But we often get back to, you know what, I got this. And then we put our backpack on and we carry it around, and, we got it figured out.
Yeah, it's very countercultural too if you just look society in the face and say, I'm not here to serve my physical health. I could not care less, but that's not going to be the primary concern. And
right.
I would say I do not seek a long life. That is not what I primarily seek. Like, whoa, hold on. How am I going to sell you drugs?
Yeah.
How am I going to sell you this workout plan? If that's
there you
not
go.
Your primary seek. So they're like, I actually don't. I don't primarily seek wealth, a wealthy life.
Yeah.
Poverty is not something to be shunning my life away from. I'm here to made to praise, revere, and serve God. It's not to be healthy. It's not to be wealthy. It's not to have a relationship with my kids. It's not to have a relationship with my wife. It's not to have a big impact on the world vocationally. It's not to have a big impact on the world through volunteer work. It's not to have great relationships. Those are not the primary purpose.
From a purpose standpoint,
that's
right?
not what I serve.
Right.
Those are not the things that I serve.
But when it comes to the intentions now,
So
how do those work with that purpose?
So you say, how do you you live a life? How do you fulfill your purpose? And I would say you have, for me, I like the framework of these 3 macro areas and then the 9 micro areas of life. And practically we have actions that should align towards goals. And then you ask, to what ends are those goals achieving? Right. And so a lot of people will start with the goals and then they kind of flounder around. And then you have a midlife crisis where you're not quite sure what direction your goals are pointing towards. But a good question to ask is, to what ends? To what ends does this goal achieve? So an example would be like running a long race. Right. Like, well, why would you
the one on your shirt, I think, says 200. Is that miles?
They're miles. Yep. Freedom units.
How many days again?
So this took me, it was 4 days.
4 days of running, and how many hours of sleep in that?
5 hours. Or
so
4.5.
Call that just 4.5 hours of tire changing, right?
Yeah.
In
the mountains.
Indy race.
So it's at between 7,200 and 9,500 feet of elevation. Over 37 feet cumulative of elevation gain and loss. So this is more like mountaineering in the mountains of Lake
Incredible. Tahoe. To what ends? So when did that become?
So that was not a goal that I had 15 years ago.
Yeah, right.
But the intention of what that should ultimately lead to has not changed.
Yeah.
Right. And I'd say the intentions in my physical area are, I want to treat my body like a temple, acknowledging the Holy Spirit fills it, and be physically able and capable to do as I'm called to do. And that could look like a million different things.
100%.
I found myself kind of leaning towards these ultra endurance events, and I feel like they're good frameworks and goals that help me move closer to that intention, or continue to move in the direction of that intention. Now, if I, trip and fall and break my femur, or if I have to get a leg, amputated or something like that, I'm probably not going to have many ultra endurance running events on my goal chart.
It might be over.
But I will definitely find other physical goals that help align towards that intention, that intention should never change.
So how do you set goals around the intentionality, specifically around serving and loving your wife and your children in the season that they're in? Because the needs could be endless, and you could get lost in just serving your children, right? So back to your point about what are the ends to what ends, and what are the means to the ends? You know, how I guess the question specifically is, how do you set goals in those two life categories?
Yep. So with my kids, I have two primary intentions. One, that they would desire a relationship with their parents, and two, that they would realize their holy destiny potential. And so those are the intentions. Those are the areas they always want to be moving towards. They never achieve and never land on. Right? You always kind of move in that direction. Goals for me come from the prep work of this document that I use, which is you look at your milestones. So what have you accomplished in the past? Brain dump a bunch of ideas, but also look at your roadblocks and your resources. So what are some of the roadblocks to achieving your intentions in this life area? What are some of the resources to achieving your intentions in those life areas? Sometimes a combination of that, or just percolating out ideas and then reflecting on your milestones will help tell you what you should be focused on this next
Informs
quarter.
you.
So it might be something like, I want to take my kids and do a work day once a quarter. Or every night I want to have a routine that I go through them with them on. One of the things I do with my kids is I tell them every single night, I have a question for you. Like, what? A question. Did you know that I love you so much? Yeah. Did you know that you make me so happy? Did you know that I'm so happy you're my son or daughter?
Oh, so good.
And so that's
3 questions.
That's 3 questions. That's something that they will hear thousands of times.
Wow.
Over the next, while they're in my house, basically.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Did I tell you that I love you? Is that what it was?
Yep.
Did I tell you I'm proud of you?
You make me so happy.
You make me so happy. That's not a question.
Did you know?
Did you know? Okay, so it is a question.
Yeah.
Do you know that you make me so happy?
Yeah.
And 3 is,
I'm so happy that you are my
son or daughter.
Yeah.
So that's, did you know that I'm so happy that you are my son?
So that's just like propaganda 101. Like they are just going to have that beaten into their brain.
That's it, right?
Thousands of times.
And this is the reality, man. Like 40 years old, my birthday, excuse me, I spent 4 nights up north going through a Wild at Heart retreat. And at the principal, we talked about this sort of recently, but, and it's amazing that you're saying this right now, because at the core, I think a lot of our dysfunction and trauma as human adults come back to areas of our life that were childish or children, where we fractured and never moved past a particular layer of growth we needed to. So for example, dealing with anger, right? And having poor abilities to have parents to find a way to calm me down or work with me in a way that I felt understood. And so my ability to manage my emotions, my EIQ, was never developed in the way it should have, right? And so that fracture has happened for many, many, many years. And so then we tend to act a certain way called posing or poser that works in conjunction to hide that, right? Debilitating defect or whatever. But at the end of the day, we start stripping all this stuff out. And as we think about all those fractures, the core at which we can really identify with God, our Father, is to hear the things called, at the end, well done, good and faithful servant. Well, thinking about what Jesus did, God the Father said to him, "This is my son, whom which I'm well pleased." That describes the role that the Father intentionally wants to seek out of his son, making him hear that, having him understand that. The child then develops my Father loves me and I want to please him, and that he's proud of me. And when you hear that as a child, your identity continues to point back to, as a dad, as a human, as a imperfect father, we fail, but my love for you, and that will never change despite the circumstances that you fail or which you feel inadequate, because and they will never have that daddy issue that many men are discovering in their 20s, 30s, and 40s, that our identity in Christ is that of a son to please the Father. So I don't know who taught you that. Who taught you that?
I don't remember. I think I just came up with it.
I mean, that right there is a book, because I never realized that level of depth, because I went back to even my own story, and I had a great relationship with my dad. And I could tell you, my dad was the guy that got all the benefit, the reward, the high five, because he was at my ball games. He helped me with math, and we played catch every night. But I don't recall him saying, I love you, I'm proud of you, and that
I'm so happy
that you're my son.
Yep.
And that's the crap at 40 years old. I had to hear his voice, God's voice, say, whatever he failed.
Let's say I try and do it every single night. Let's say travel, whatever. It's 333 nights a year. Right? And say my daughter's 10.
So you're missing 10%.
She's going to hear it, probably 3,000 times before she leaves the house from here on out. And it's just that is like propaganda. Just like beat that into her head so like she never forgets it. And she's at the age too. She's 10. She's got hopefully a handful of years before boys start coming in the picture. But I'm always trying to like rub her shoulders and like, you have all the love you need from your dad. I just want you to know that. You do not need to go and seek love from other people.
Dude, it's so good.
You've got all that you need.
And even for them to know that, right? It's a reminder and grounding that they don't, to your point, have to go look.
Not a perfect father.
No.
Right.
Right.
Last night, 9:00, they're like, will you read a book with me? I'm like, no way. It's too late. Go to bed. In retrospect, is it worth the 10 minutes of extra sleep for them and me to have them feel like they're not worth the time?
Yeah.
But am I also reinforcing that we have rules and we have boundaries and expectations of bedtime? So there's this constant stance and trade-off that I'm sure I'm imperfect in many different ways.
Well, speaking of that, so part of what I love about this show is there's a position that people might find, specifically that this person is highly successful, that he's got things figured out. He's doing things that I wish I could start doing, or maybe I should start doing, but I don't have enough discipline. Whatever it is, there's always a perception, and there's reality. And right, what I love and what I've done and been intentional about more recently is whenever I see a kid of mine go down this path where they try to tell themselves stories about inadequacy or not measuring up, not only do I deflect that and tell them that's baloney, I go into a mode of telling them all of my particular sin struggles or failures or traumas or stories I tell myself that aren't true, to help them know that they're not alone, and to also realize that their dad is also imperfect. So as I'm sitting here with Jason, and crazy endurance runner, and built some successful businesses, and has at least had sex 5 times because he's got 5 kids, right? I mean, dang, right? What are your sin struggles? Where are the areas of your life that Jesus is working in you right now that, or maybe have made great progress, but still have in the past traumas you're working through, or even specifically something that you've squashed that you have moved on from because of his love and support and helping you through it?
Yeah. I think a lot, like people that I know, in small groups, whatever, they'll talk about like discipline is just so easy for you. I wish I could have that discipline level or whatever it may be. And I would just say for me, my default is to not do at all what I want to do. And that is probably a misconception. And I remember when I was in my early to mid 20s and I was sitting at every Sunday night I go through priority management exercise. And so that's kind of like the basics of how do you do what you want to do this next week. So what are the things?
Party management?
Sorry, I wish it was Priority
management. Got it.
101. So you brain dump everything. You put a time block to it, or you assign a time to it. Then you start to prioritize. And one of the things that have the highest impact towards the goals you want to achieve. Yep. So it's like a intentional living light.
Yep.
But I would do this. It would probably take me 2 or 3 hours every Sunday.
Oh my gosh.
And I had a roommate who was like, "What a waste of time. You could have been crossing things off your list for the last 3 hours." I'm like, I know that would be great. For me in my life, I find that, however many hours are in the rest of the week, I just am not a great steward of them unless I do this intentional exercise and put some structure to it. And so that is probably one of my strengths and weaknesses, is that without intentionality and structure, my default state is to be very unintentional with my time and do things that are unimportant to me. But because I have that weakness So we talked a little bit about reactive versus structural discipline. I may have pretty weak reactive discipline, but my structural discipline, because of the recognition of the absence of that, my structural discipline is very high.
Yeah. Yeah. So you be a guy to set very good guardrails and boundaries to prevent significant
So
loss.
I'm great at having healthy snacks in our house. If I go to the office and there's a donut, I probably have a tummy ache that night.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like the things that I struggle with are that reactive discipline versus the structural discipline.
Yeah. And isn't that it? So like in part of, we shared with you a little bit that in Bema, like part of the character of God is that our God is a God who knows when to stop creating. Our God is a God who knows when enough is enough. And part of that is just understanding discipline. And discipline is such a word that I realized I was missing. Like to control, and this is fundamental to Genesis, right? To control those emotions, so much so that the anger from Cain to Abel led to result of death, right? For the inability to control those emotions. And that's in poor discipline. So unpacking that is like recognizing the areas that which we succumb to our flesh, right? And like, oh, donut. And, you know, the only other way to avoid that donut is like basically saying, I can have 0 sweets. And if I do have a sweet, I'm creating a massive consequence, and I'm going to have all kinds of accountability people. They're going to hold me to the fire, right? Like, but on the flip side, is that the intent you want to go? So in the meantime, you have to create this window of discipline that you're always moving, advancing towards, right? I mean, but otherwise you're at risk at making that a problem. Well, at least you won't go to the office every day. So now you have, right.
Yeah. And it helps to remind it too. That's another thing for me is you think that I just know what I want in life. And I found that for me, I review my intentions every single night. Every single night, I'll look at my purpose, my intentions, and my passions. It's on the home screen of my phone. And then when I put my phone on airplane mode, I have a shortcut where I'm like goes to like a folder of screenshots that have all the scriptures that back those up, that back those intentions up. That is something that I have to review every single day. Or otherwise, because you can't structure everything out in your life, and you go to the office and you'll see a donut, and you're like, oh wait, what is the intention of my physical life again? And if I haven't reviewed it in a long time, it won't be in front of mine. So that's something I found for myself is I require the repetition of remembering every single day. And it's kind of like showering. Like I wish I could shower once, be clean for a long time. I find that I have to shower typically about every single day. The same thing with, there's an old German Baptist joke where it's like, I told my wife on my wedding day, I love you, and I'll let you know if anything changes.
Yeah, right, that's it.
But no, you got to tell your wife that you love her every
day. Yeah. So that's incredible. So those intentions that you're reviewing, how often do those change? Because purpose shouldn't really change, right?
Yeah, I would say the intentions haven't changed a ton in the last 15 years. Maybe wordsmith a little different. I did reintroduce the social category in the last couple of quarters and the volunteer category in the last couple of years. So those were two when I first started going through this exercise. I was like, they were completely blank. I ended up just deleting them. I was like, it's not a focus of mine at the time. As I've started to build a foundation, I say start with the economic engine. And this is not prescriptive how to do this. It's just descriptive of how I did it. Those have been things that have been reintroduced. But as far as changing the intentions of the life categories, I can't say that those have gone through big transformations. I think with children, I've played around with changing, that they would desire a relationship with their, I thought about changing the word from children to progeny, just to be a little more forefront of, I hope to live a very long life, and I hope to be around for my great grandkids. And what does the intention of my children category, how does that evolve when there's now multiple generations that are downstream that I have the opportunity to have an impact on? But that's not something I've changed the wording of yet.
Now the goals change how often?
Once a quarter. So once a year, I go on a silent retreat, 3-day silent retreat, reset the goals for the 1 year goals. And then your quarterly goals are always things that should be moving the ball forward on the 1 year goals.
Got it. Yeah. It's kind of like EOS or, the annual goal and rocks.
And then just like EOS, I'll do a weekly check-in, on track, off track.
Gotcha.
On each of the quarterly goals in the 9 different life categories.
Dang, man. I think that's developed quite a bit of discipline. So what is the meaning behind all of this? Like if you were just to summarize it, like why is it important to get this
Probably
intentional?
call it Stewardpreneur.
Nice. Honestly,
I would say, entrepreneurship, you have the ability to craft the life that you want,
Yep.
to craft the life you design. I found in retirement, it requires a lot more intentionality than when I'm in income generating seasonal life. When I'm in my income generating seasonal life, it is very reactive. What's going to happen to me that day for 8 to 14 hours of the day, it's telling me what's going to happen for the most part.
Yeah.
As I've entered into that retirement season, it requires a lot more intentionality because nothing's screaming at me of this is what's going to happen. And I get to now be a lot more intentional and architect what I want to choose to do. So that's kind of the entrepreneurial part of it. The stewardship part is somewhat of that investor mindset of you never want to be satisfied. No one is happy. If you're an investor and you buy a stock and it's worth $10, it better not be worth $10 next year.
I mean, simply put, right?
$10.08, right? Or something like that.
Yeah, there's something about just creating a return. But I guess even more fundamental than that, what I always just remind people of is when it's your $10 or $10 that your dad gave you and said, you better make it last, right? Like if it's someone else's versus yours, how does that play into it?
I think just psychologically, and you've probably found this being a small business owner, martyrdom is oftentimes a release valve for accountability that I think a lot of self-employed business owners like to pull. Whether it's the accountability with their employees, the accountability with their bank account, the accountability with having conflict with their clients, the accountability of work-life balance. Martyrdom is oftentimes the first lever that gets pulled, as opposed to excellence in each of those categories.
How does that play out in business? So in the concept of money,
it would be, here's a house. It should have taken 100 hours to paint. My crew is in it 110 hours. We're already over budget. I'm just going to paint the rest of it myself. As opposed to leaning in on the crew and being like, hey, let's do a breakdown of how this went. Or then on the next house saying, I'm going to start to break this into smaller chunks, and we're going to break this into each side of the house, and I'm going to hold accountability, and now I have to go through the hard work of training with you.
Yep.
Or maybe a client has an expectation that's unfounded, and are you going to lean into that conflict and call them out on it? Or are you going to be a pushover and just say, client's always right, which was not the true, that phrase has been misused in the past. The full phrase is the client is always right in matters of taste. So the client is always right in matters of taste, meaning that they can buy whatever hat they want.
Sure.
And they're right.
Yep.
They like the hat, they want it. The client is not always right when it comes to what does the contract say, or their ability to treat your laborers in a certain way.
Yeah.
The client is not always right there. They're only right in matters of taste, meaning that they can buy what they want.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a fine line between even servanthood and stewardship, right? And serving is we're all called to serving, but at some point, if we're serving, and that's great, but it's at the cost of something else that is not yours to be deciding that it's a trade-off for that cost, stewardship can trump that. And stewardship reminds us that there is an accountability and that for much is given, much is expected, and that there is a return that comes with this, and it's not yours, right? That it's his, and if it all belongs to him, he's going to ask you what you did with what he gave you. Yep. Right? So fantastic when you really think about it. So in all of this, as we start to wind down, you've become a man who has really been able to be a people person first by picking good partners and leveraging relationships, and starting with, the relationship with Jesus, but also relationship with your wife, relationship with your current partners in the business. Even picking painting partners. Yep. What is a common theme, and what if you really had to find okay to compromise, and what areas are non-negotiable? Yeah,
there has to be trust. I think partnership comes down to trust, and that's probably the most foundational element. I think you start to break trust into, I think it's the 4 C's. So what is their character? Is it someone that you trust to do the right thing when you're not watching? Right? Do they have a strong character? Do they have a common sense of purpose? So is what they want what you want? Do you have a common sense of purpose?
I like that.
Do they have competency? Would be the third one, right? So do I trust that they can do this well? Do I trust that you have the competency to carry out the role that we're partnering in together? Yep. And the fourth one is kind of more like what's the word? Chemistry.
There we go.
Yep. So do I just vibe with this person?
Right.
So character, common sense of purpose, competency, and then chemistry.
Yeah.
That's what you look for in a partner.
So when does those 4 C's most often get questioned with business partnerships, in marriage, in your own flesh struggles?
Yeah. I think a lot of it is set up in the architecture, and you can avoid some of those things, so you can set yourself up for failure, almost in some senses.
Yeah.
So, with your spouse, for me, there's a little bit of due diligence that's done. So there's an initial interest, then there's some due diligence that's done, then there's a letter of intent, and then you go forward. And that one is a very unique partnership because it's a covenant, so it's different than every other partnership.
Yeah, it's a promise to deliver without an exchange, right? It's a how would you describe it? Covenant versus a contract.
Is like, it's more. It's a covenant with God more than it is a covenant with my wife.
Yeah,
as much as it is a covenant with my wife.
For sure.
So I'm making a promise to God
Yeah.
that this is going to be my spouse. We're going to experience we're going to experience holy matrimony together for the rest of our lives.
But I think covenant requires only something of you. It's
Okay.
not an exchange.
Okay.
As a contract has an exchange.
Okay, that's a good
right?
call out.
Yeah. And I think that's important because it's like a promise.
Yep.
Because the promises don't truly ultimately often have consequences.
Sure.
It's a credibility of a character. I wonder if there's a 5C, credibility.
Credibility.
If credibility helps establish trust because of past.
Yep.
Interesting.
Yeah. So it's kind of like even if statements, right?
Yeah,
With your
yeah.
spouse. So even if we get poor, even if you get sick,
Right.
even if she ends up having a mental illness to where she's a completely different person than I married, the covenant is still there. And so she could get something mentally wrong with her and turn into a completely different person and very, very wild. And I would just say, well, that is not what I signed up for, but is what I signed up for.
So when there's a change in behavior that might turn her into 400 pounds,
Yep.
and you have a covenant, her character is questioned, right? So like, where is it your role as a husband then to love her and bring in the reminder of what you signed up for in the framework of the 4 C's?
Yeah.
Like, I'm curious,
That's a great
right?
question.
Like,
I don't know if I have all the answers to
no,
that.
but this is good philosophy
Yeah.
around setting expectations, managing expectations, managing what others say they're going to do, and that'll apply to a partnership next, right? In business,
Yeah. I think.
bad boy clauses.
Yep. I think calling out, coming with curiosity, not judgment, and then it's hard because you got to be prepared for any outcome. But to say, what do you want? Can I help you get there? That's how I would approach it.
Yeah,
But also being prepared for, like I said, if my wife had a mental disorder and she just went off the rails, I believe I would be called to serve her continuously.
and I think that one for some reason makes it easier because it's almost like first you have to understand and appreciate that what she might be going through might have a lack of control, right? The ability to control. But when there's actually something she continues to do,
Sure.
like maybe a relationship from the past, right?
Yeah.
Or even in the current where there's a sin struggle that's getting in the way of intimacy, right? And maybe you're choosing to live a certain way and you're taking the high road, but you see your spouse continue to stumble on the same things, and it comes down to selfishness. It comes down to whatever those things are.
Yeah.
What have you found to be the most helpful in partnerships where the brute force won't work, but the love, right? And it is a practical question because I think we all have relationships and partnerships that aren't just quite where they want them to be. And so the biggest struggle isn't to call them out and come at them, but what is best practice in this framework?
How do you lead through influence, not control?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
When you don't have control.
Right.
And that's the difference between managing and leading. Managers can use control and say, do this or you're fired. Leaders have to say, how do I influence you to follow me?
Because you really want them to choose.
Yeah. I have influence, not control. And that's similar with like a minority partnership. I don't have control. There are some bad boy clauses, but ultimately, how do I help influence this person?
So then how do you raise your level of influence when maybe there's some past things to work through, right? With your wife or with business partners, right? So this happened, I forgive you, we'll move forward, but there still might be this this healing that needs to happen, and it's going to take time, and it's going to have skeletons that keep kind of rearing their ugly head. How do you increase your influence through those seasons?
I don't know all the answers. I think one of the biggest ways to have influence is to have a relationship with people, and that takes time. It takes intentionality. But I don't know I don't know the best answer of how do you overcome friction in relationships that has happened other than time. And
I think you're onto something there, because what you said actually requires, and I believe ultimately becomes the answer. And your exact words were something about relationship. What'd you say?
Yeah. How do you have influences through a relationship?
So in that relationship, right, requires this level of depth to get underneath the question behind the question behind the question.
Yeah.
And that relationship allows for that vulnerability.
Yeah. Relationship first. So beyond it, so you have transaction and get deep and go to relationship.
Yep.
But how you just foundationally get deep.
Right. And I think, behind all of that is, again, just back to your purpose and how the Lord, you will be revered and praised, revered,
serve God.
and serve. Yeah. Right. And so okay, how does my purpose need to be illustrated in this exercise with my wife and this exercise with my partner? Yeah. Right. And having a personal mission statement to go back to, a purpose statement to go back to. Mm-hmm. And again, we're talking about fundamental things that most people don't do, but that are transformative when put into practice, right? So this is just great discussion, because anytime I meet a guy who starts thinking about the multiple facets of life and getting to a point where, I have to show up to work because I want to, and it's not a have to, it's a want to. Mm-hmm. It's a great day for me. So thanks for all the insights. I loved just picking your brain, and even the framework around the life coaching stuff that seems like hasn't really modified from its original version. Right. I mean,
more like L10 add-ons.
Yeah. That's still okay. I mean, there's the EOS process, I believe, can be. An implementer might disagree, though.
Sure.
Yeah. Dude, thank you so much for making it on the show. I loved hearing from you, Jason. And this has been another episode of Successfully Unsuccessful. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time.